If I could ask everyone to please find their seats. We're on a very tight schedule and incredibly appreciative of Congressman Donovan making time out of an insanely busy schedule. The Hill is in super high gear right now, and if I'm not mistaken, your Homeland Security Committee has 2 simultaneous hearings today. So thanks for giving us the time to join us today. I'm going to quickly turn this over to my co-conspirator and a longtime friend, Chuck DeWitt. Chuck is no stranger to the law enforcement community, a former director of the National Institute of Justice, deeply involved in the National Consortium for Advanced Policing, the major metropolitan police entities, and just a longtime friend, and also someone who's done so much for the law enforcement community. I'll have Chuck introduce the congressman. I just want to underscore that the issue of cybersecurity and state and local law enforcement in particular is probably one of the most underappreciated. You can't walk anywhere in D.C. without hearing cyber, 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 cyber. It's kids' soccer, it's the shiny toy, everyone's swarming that ball. But the reality is when you have the next set of issues, it's still treated by and large as a federal set of issues. So through the National Consortium of Advanced Policing and our center here for Cyber and Homeland Security, we quickly concluded that law enforcement not only needs the tools to be able to enable their investigatory support, but they've also got a responsibility to protect their own systems, to protect the data that they have their hands on, especially confidential sources and the like. So this is about a 6 to 9 month effort that we put together a short report that we'll be releasing later today. Think of it as sort of the meta themes, the 101 in terms of what state and local law enforcement can, should, and ought to be considering to do, and to thank again Congressman Donovan for a member of Congress to take a leadership role on some of these issues. Again, no stranger on in the law enforcement community, and Chuck will highlight some of those points, but with all the priorities Congress has in front of them, I think we owe him a debt of gratitude to never forget that our state and local law enforcement are on the front lines of this war, in the front lines of this campaign, and they need the ammunition and the resources to get the job done. So Chuck, let me turn it over to you to introduce the congressman.
Good morning. I'm here representing the chiefs of police from every major city in the United States. We call ourselves Major City Chiefs. We're pleased to have this opportunity to come together with you and be part of the program today. I'd like to say a couple of very positive things about the program today, because it's not often you can say positive things here in Washington. The forum today is something we owe to Frank, something that brings everyone here together, and it's not like what we usually see in Washington, contentious political conflict, the issues that divide us. These are the issues that bring us together, and thanks to Frank, we come together with a unity of purpose today, both the terrorist threat that Congressman Donovan will speak about shortly, and a cyber threat as well. So I hope you'll join me in thanking our host, Frank Salico. Thank you, Frank. We're releasing today this report that Frank described. It's on the cyber threat, and it was produced by an organization I'm going to tell you just a little bit about, the National Consortium for Advanced Policing, NCAP. NCAP was founded out in Los Angeles by then LAPD Police Chief Bill Bratton. And Bill felt very strongly, after his previous experience in law enforcement at several jurisdictions, that we needed an organization that would develop programs that would meet the needs and priorities of local law enforcement agencies and institute approaches by and for local law enforcement. So Bill established that program. We have with us today Deputy LAPD Chief Mike Downing, who runs the CT program and has continued the good work of Bill and what NCAP is doing. And of course, everyone here I'm sure knows that Bill Bratton has since returned to New York City, and we thank him for having made NCAP possible. This report initially began its roots back when Bill Bratton was president, and now he goes on at New York. Speaking of New York, let me tell you about our speaker today, because we're very fortunate to have him here. As Frank mentioned, he has left his very important and very powerful committee on the Hill to be with us today. He chairs the Committee on Emergency Preparedness, Response, and Communications. And that really says it all, doesn't it? That's why we're all here. That's what we all do. And I'm sure that all of you have come to hear Dan Donovan today because of his important position in that committee. I'd like to tell you a little bit about him as a person and what he means to all of us and local law enforcement. He was born and raised in Staten Island and has never forgotten his roots. He had the opportunity when he got out of law school to do a lot of things, but like many of us, he took an oath to serve and protect. He went to work for the district attorney's office and became a prosecutor. He did that faithfully for many years until he had the opportunity to run for office in his home, Richmond County, where he was handily elected more than once to become the district attorney there in Staten Island, where he served for many years and could boast to this day about the highest felony conviction rate of the boroughs of New York. So he is someone who may be here in Washington today chairing a powerful committee, but like many of us in law enforcement, he's not forgotten that oath he took years ago, and his feet are firmly planted on the streets of New York, where he continues to protect and serve all of those who brought him to office. He's introduced recently some exciting new legislation. He has several important programs underway, and I hope you'll join me in welcoming the chairman, Dan Donovan.
Chuck, thank you for that kind introduction. My mother passed this March at ripe age of 89, and before she did pass, she wrote Chuck's introduction for me, and you read it just the way she did. Thank you so much. Thank all of you for allowing me to be with you today. Chuck and many people in this room have been a great resource to me. I've been in Congress. I was elected in a special election last May 5th actually, and unlike people who get elected in November and have till January to staff up, I was sworn in a week later on May 12th, and then the following Tuesday, May 19th, I had my very first baby at the age of 58, so I had a life changed last May. This May was a little bit calmer, but I am so glad to be with all of you, and as I said, you guys have been a great resource to me in helping local entities, particularly in the area of federal grant funding. I always think that the people on the ground, the folks, the localities know how to do this. Government's role in a lot of this, federal government's role in a lot of this should be to give you the resources to do your work and then get the hell out of your way and let you go do it. Today I want to speak to you about, and the purpose of your gathering is to talk about the role of state and local law enforcement in improving the nation's cybersecurity defenses. As Chuck said in his introduction, before I came to Congress, I was the district attorney of Staten Island for 12 years, and before that I was an assistant DA in the Manhattan DA's office. When I began my career in law enforcement, a cyber threat was the possibility of an IBM computer falling off a shelf and hitting someone. But at the time I left law enforcement, 20-some-odd years later, cybersecurity consumes a huge and growing portion of our public and private budgets. Today's cyber threats present never-before-seen challenges to local investigators, prosecutors, and judges. Cybersecurity has been traditionally and mistakenly perceived as a federal responsibility. But cyber thieves, hackers, and foreign countries do not follow lines of jurisdiction and don't wait for a federal contractor to update a code. I want to commend the National Consortium for Advanced Policing for your work for releasing the Cyber Guide for state and local law enforcement today. Your efforts are addressing an immediate law enforcement need. It's imperative to ensure that state and local officials, as well as first responders, are prepared to protect against and respond to a cyber attack. Localities must know our adversaries and how they intend to exploit cyber vulnerabilities, and who they should call should an intrusion or an attack occur. Make no mistake, the cyber threat is real. Already, hackers have attempted to interfere with 911 call centers, send out inaccurate alerts and warnings, and release the personal information of law enforcement officers. Local policing itself is becoming more reliant on networks that can be vulnerable to intrusions. In New York City, every police officer on the street is connected to a central hub through department-issued smartphones and tablets. This technology provides them with access to databases containing millions of records with personal identifying information and other confidential location information. From the perspective of the police officer, he or she's smartphone is a tool that gives essential and situational awareness when responding to a call. Rather than going in blind, he or she arrives with crucial context and information about those that they may encounter at the scene. However, should hackers compromise this network, information could grind to a halt and officers become disconnected to their headquarters, not to mention the confidential data that a breach could compromise. Each link asset can be a new vulnerability. I don't want to be an alarmist, but the days of vulnerability extending only to brick and mortar infrastructure are over. Congress has taken numerous steps to increase our capabilities, and progress has been made, but it's clear that we still have a long way to go. Unfortunately, we can't ignore the fact that for the fourth year in a row, the National Preparedness Report released by FEMA says that states continue to report that cybersecurity is at the lowest core capability. This is true even at the most well-resourced state and major city departments, let alone agencies in smaller jurisdictions, which have more difficulty building in-house expertise. Even while state and local officials are doing their best to address the threat, they depend on federal government for guidance and assistance. As I said at a recent joint hearing on cyber preparedness, it's been 6 years since the release of the interim draft of the National Cyber Incident Response Plan, but DHS still doesn't have a finalized and approved NCHRP. Developing and finalizing this plan needs to become a priority. Further, confusion still exists about whom states should talk to when cyber incidents occur. Cyber information sharing between federal government and the emergency management and first responder communities is ad hoc at best. Emergency personnel will be the first on the scene and should have insight into whether the incident to which they are responding to has been caused by a cyber attack. In fact, the recommendations in the Cyber Guide for state and local law enforcement, while targeted for local agencies, dovetails with work that still needs to be done at the federal level. In my mind, nothing illustrates this more clearly than the theft of more than 20 million records from the Federal Office of Personnel Management. This unprecedented hack, which exposed the most intimate details of personnel with security clearances, revealed an agency that has failed to follow even the most basic good practices recommended by this guide. Under Chairman McCall, the House Homeland Security Committee has made oversight of DHS cyber efforts a top priority. In addition to passing the landmark Cybersecurity Act as a part of last year's omnibus legislation, the committee has considered a number of bills that specifically target state and local law enforcement. I want to concentrate on 3 of these bills because I think each of them illustrate a different key aspect of the challenge. 1, the need for training. 2, to improve communications. And 3, a consistent federal investment during a time in which strained local budgets is something everyone's facing. The first bill is the Strengthening State and Local Cyber Crime Fighting Act. It codifies the training provided by the United States Secret Service to state and local investigators, prosecutors, and judges. The Secret Service training focuses on how to investigate cyber and electronic crimes, conduct computer and mobile device forensic examinations, and conduct network intrusion investigations. The second piece of legislation, the State and Local Cyber Protection Act, directs the National Cybersecurity and Communications Integration Center at the Department of Homeland Security to coordinate with state and local governments and to provide assistance to secure their information systems. The NCIC can help identify cyber vulnerabilities and inform locals about cybersecurity best practices. The final piece of legislation I want to introduce to you is the Cyber Preparedness Act. And the reason I want to include that is because I sponsored it. This makes permanent the ability of state and local jurisdictions to use FEMA preparedness grants for cybersecurity. The bill also seeks to improve information sharing with state and major urban areas, fusion centers, and authorizes the deployment of fusion center personnel to the NCIC. My legislation urges DHS to improve communication of unclassified threat information to state fusion centers so that fusion centers can share that information with stakeholders who may not have clearances, but nevertheless need to know that information. I introduced the Cyber Preparedness Act to address information we received from witnesses at our cyber preparedness hearing. We plan to continue to refine that bill over the next several weeks and look forward to engaging with you to ensure that the needs of state and local law enforcement is met. I'd like to close my remarks by quoting from DHS Secretary Jay Johnson. Jay said, and I quote, "Cybersecurity is a shared responsibility." And it boils down to this. In cybersecurity, the more systems we secure, the more secure we are. We are all connected online, and a vulnerability in one place can cause a problem in many other places. So everyone needs to work on this. Government officials and business leaders, security professionals, and utility owners and operators. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is why we are here today. I look forward to working with you to ensure that states and localities have the tools and support they need to address this emerging cyber threat. The Cybersecurity Guide for state and local law enforcement will go a long way towards helping law enforcement stakeholders integrate cybersecurity awareness into their daily operations, and in the event of a major incident, provide them with the link they need to the appropriate federal resource. I once again thank you for hosting this today. I once again want to thank you for helping me to become a better member of Congress to help each and every one of you. Again, law enforcement on the ground are the people that do this every day. A bureaucrat in Washington shouldn't be telling you how to do your job. Congress should be supplying you with the resources to do that. And I thank you every day for what you do. Please tell the men and women that you represent that their nation appreciates their duty and their call to protect our citizens, my family, and please ask them to do it safely. Be safe. Thank you.
Being respectful of your time, we have
we can
5 minutes
Yep.
for a question. So normally I'd be asking all the questions, but I want to give the audience
Yours are
an
too difficult.
opportunity.
Somebody asked me
So,
an easy question.
any quick questions? Other than one thing, and Chuck, I'll turn to you in a second, but one thing that is really refreshing to see is actually taking the advice from hearings and already codifying it into legislation.
It's funny.
I mean, that's more about how to do your job in Congress. I hope more
When
follow your
I
lead.
got to Congress and I sat through my first couple of hearings and heard experts in so many fields testify before us, and hear my colleagues ask very pointed questions. Afterward, I asked the staff, now what do we do with this? And the next day we'd have another hearing. And I never knew what happened to the information we obtained in the first hearing. And by the time I was here for 3 weeks, we had 12 different hearings worth of information, and I wasn't sure anyone did anything with it. So when I became the chairman of the Committee on Emergency Preparedness, Response, and Communication, I said to the staff, we don't need to hold a hearing every week. I don't need to take people out of the field from what they're doing and sit before members of Congress and let them recite what we already know, what they're doing. What we ought to do is ask them how we could help them do that. And so each of the hearings that my subcommittee has taken, and we did a field hearing yesterday in Jersey City and spoke to first responders about the flexibility of the grants that we issue. And are they flexible enough? And the time frames in which we constrain that you have to use the money in, is that long enough for you? Or is it too difficult in a 2 or 3 year period to use the money that we grant you? And we take that information and, frankly, we've done something with it.
No, it's awesome.
So please don't think that when we come here, listen, about 2 of you in this room could vote for me. So I'm not doing it for that. I'm doing it to introduce myself to you and to ask for your assistance in how we could better help you. I told you, I have a 1-year-old now. I need our nation to be protected now more than ever because of her. So I will take the information you provide. If any of you are kind enough to testify before any of us in the hearings, we will take your expertise and your guidance and put that to use. So I thank you for bringing that up.
I might underscore anything anyone here can do to apply positive pressure on the Senate side. You've got 55 bills from your committee alone that are sitting on the Senate. Chuck, you wanted to ask a question?
I wanted to ask the chairman a quick question about another bill that he's proposed relating to terrorist assets. Wonderful bipartisan bill that all the chiefs are going to support very strongly. I should add, the chairman is a Republican who was elected from a community of mostly Democrats, and it speaks volumes about his bipartisan leadership. And this important bill that he's just introduced a week ago is an example of that.
Thank you, Chuck. I was a prosecutor. My first 8 years, I was a narcotics prosecutor. We did wonderful with asset forfeiture. We took drug dealers' money, and we used it to fight against drug dealers. I got to Congress and realized we froze assets of terrorists and terrorist states in our country, in our own American banks. A system that they despise and they assault our country over, our financial system, yet they were benefiting from it. When we released the assets to Iran after we froze those assets for a gazillion years, of the $150 billion in which we gave the Iranian government back, something like $30 billion of it was in interest. They benefited from our financial system. My bill will seize the interest of the frozen assets and use it to fight terrorism. We will take the terrorists' money and use it to combat them. And if a terrorist organization is not removed from the terrorist list and their assets aren't unfrozen after a year, we're going to take the principal too. We would have had, if we had taken the interest from the Iranians, about $30 billion to fight terrorism. The administration gave that back to the Iranians. If my bill is passed, we will have that to fight them. Thank you for bringing it up, Chuck. Thank you.
Congressman,
Thank you, guys.
Thank you for taking time out of your insane week.
Chuck, anything else? I'll see you.
So we'll quickly turn now to Usha, who's going to give a quick presentation on the guide itself.
Good afternoon. My name is Usha Sutliff, and I'm a program manager at Lafayette Group, a government consulting firm in Vienna, Virginia. We supported the National Consortium for Advanced Policing, or NCAP, on this project to help state and local law enforcement think through how to get smart on cybersecurity. And the result is the guide that will be emailed to all of you after this event. I've been asked to provide you with a brief overview of the guide, but first I'll say that it does not stand alone. This project was done in partnership with the Center for Cyber and Homeland Security and with the support of law enforcement leaders like LAPD Deputy Chief Michael Downing, Mike Senna, Ed Cabrera, who you will hear from today. I encourage you to read, as a companion to the guide, the issue brief on cybersecurity that was written by Frank Salufo and Chief Downing. For the changes we collectively recommend must be made at all levels of government. So, pardon me, but I'm from Los Angeles, and Frank already gave me the word I'm going to use. We're going to go meta for a minute, and I'm going to tell you about this guide. The guide I wrote, along with my colleague, Tara Richardson, who could not be here today, started with one key question. What do cops need to know about cybersecurity? To find the answer, we did a lot of research, and we put together a truly excellent working group of cybersecurity experts from federal, state, and local law enforcement agencies, academia, the private sector, and fusion centers. The end result is a highly practical guide that's broken into 3 sections. The first section is a primer on cybersecurity for any law enforcement executive or officer who seeks to demystify the topic and to understand in practical terms why he or she even needs to be concerned about it. We look at who's targeting law enforcement agencies, why they're targeting, and how they're targeting. We also take a close look at the cyber ecosystem, if you will, of any law enforcement agency, large or small. And that means all the communication centers, the databases, the wireless devices, the personal devices, and even the heating and air conditioning systems of any agency. Basically, anything that could make an agency vulnerable from a cyber perspective. The second section focuses on what agencies, large and small, can do to create an awareness of cybersecurity practices throughout the organization and an enterprise-wide cybersecurity solution that can be sustained in the long run. We emphasize free resources and provide a detailed roadmap to get departments started. The third section provides a list of resources across the spectrum that state and local agencies can use. I'll finish with a few words of what I learned from this project. 1, I learned that the cyber threats that face law enforcement could continue to outpace the capability to counter them unless one simple dynamic changes. That dynamic is a general lack of awareness of exactly what cybersecurity means to law enforcement and why it must be paid attention to at all levels of an organization. Anything related to network security or cyber has traditionally been exclusively an IT issue, or as Congressman Donovan said, a federal issue, or the purview of investigators of cybercrimes. But now we're so immersed in the cyber world on a daily basis that we are all part of both the cybersecurity problem and the solution. Every employee of a law enforcement agency must be regularly trained in cybersecurity practices to the point that he or she is able to identify a spear phishing email or know what suspicious activity looks like when it comes across the transom or affects the network. Also, the civilian keepers of the kingdom, the IT department I mentioned before, must be brought in as true partners and also vetted as extensively as the law enforcement officers they work with, such as the critical nature of their jobs. My second takeaway had to do with what's at stake for law enforcement agencies. The threat here extends well beyond the operational impacts of websites taken offline to the safety and personal lives of officers. I'm talking about the doxing, or release of private information with malicious intent, of officers' home addresses, where their children go to school, and other personal information. I'm also talking about the potential compromise of systems that tie directly to officers' safety in the field and to databases that, if compromised, could expose confidential informants and other case-related information. As we detail in the guide, the most chilling aspect of these threats is that they come from both outside and within. Beyond this range of threats lies the issue of trust. The public expects law enforcement agencies to do all they can to protect the sensitive data they are in charge of, as do other law enforcement agencies and government agencies. That's why it's so important that law enforcement agencies own this issue, just as they own issues of crime and terrorism. My third and final takeaway from this project was this. Law enforcement needs cybersecurity resources, but it has a multitude of skills at its disposal to get ahead of this threat. This profession is one of the very best when it comes to creating partnerships across all sectors of society, of sharing information, and of coming up with creative solutions despite having limited resources. These skills are critical in this area. I want to thank you for having me here today, and I hope you enjoy the guide and find it useful. Now I'd like to turn it over to Christian Beckner, who will introduce our esteemed panel.
My name is Christian Beckner. I'm the Deputy Director here at the Center for Cyber and Homeland Security, and like to, we'll broaden the aperture a bit with this panel discussion with three senior leaders who contributed to the work on the guide, but before I bring them up, would like to echo Frank's earlier remarks and thank Chuck and Usha and Tara and others at NCAP for their partnership on this project. I think the guide that they've produced is a valuable resource for state and local law enforcement, and they've done a public service by producing this, and we look forward to working with them to help get this disseminated so that every police chief and down to line officer in the country who has cyber responsibility, and really that's everyone at this point, you know, gets a copy of this guide and understands the key issues that are addressed within it. So at this point, I'd like to bring the panel on up, and I'll join them at the table for the discussion. To my immediate left is Mike Downey, Deputy Chief for Counterterrorism and the Special Operations Bureau at the Los Angeles Police Department. Mike's a member of our board of directors and a longtime active contributor to the work of the center and formerly the Homeland Security Policy Institute, and honored to have him here today to continue to support our work as he's done throughout the years. Sitting next to him is Mike Senna, another longtime collaborator and friend of our work here, and I engage with frequently when I work on the Hill on these related issues. Mike's the director of the Northern California Regional Intelligence Center, and also currently the president of the National Fusion Center Association, and an active leader on promoting the role of fusion centers within our nation's network for, originally focused on Homeland Security and counterterrorism, but increasingly on cybersecurity. And at the far end of the table, we're joined by Ed Cabrera, who currently vice president at Trend Micro, the cybersecurity company, but before that had a long, distinguished career focused on cybersecurity within the United States Secret Service, where he served as the CISO, where he served as a strategic advisor to the NCAP at the Department of Homeland Security, and somebody who brings both a federal perspective, a federal law enforcement perspective, as well as a private sector perspective to these issues. So wanted to give each of you a few minutes for some opening thoughts and comments on the report, on the set of issues that have been discussed today, what you see as some of the most important risks, the key policy challenges that each of you are facing in your day. Turn first, you Mike.
Sure. Yeah, first of all, I think
grab the mic.
I think the report, is it on, right? Yeah. I think the report was very practical. It hit on all the issues that we were looking at. I mean, 4 years ago, we went on a journey to build a cyber intrusion command center for the city of Los Angeles, and you don't know what you don't know. And when you lift up the rock and you take a peek under it, we were absolutely astonished at what we found. Just to give you an example, before the center was established, we could only scan about 3 million network activities per week. But after we established this center, it now scans over 250 million activities per day, and the city blocks about 35 million unauthorized access attempts per week. And we also stop and neutralize 2,200 actual intrusions per week before damage is inflicted. So all the categories in the report address all those issues, what's happening, what the challenges are, what technologies are using. And the reason we did this is because we wanted to know who was attacking us, what their capability was, and what the intent of the attack was. And later on in the panel, I can kind of describe a little bit more about the
Grab this one. This live. When I came into the Fusion Center Network business a decade ago, Our big threats were those physical threats, and you know, how are we going to protect ourselves from an aggressive attack by a terrorist organization? But as we started progressing, we'd get these calls from organizations going, we just lost $40,000, our systems have been compromised, and there was no one to help them. If I had somebody walk into a bank anywhere here in the district and pass someone a note and take $50, there'd be units rolling down to that. But because no one understood how to deal with the cyber threat, cyber crime, there was no one to roll out there and help them. And then as things progressed, we started dealing with crypto wall and cyber locks of systems and networks, losing 911 capability, not being able to call a dispatch center and get an officer to respond to a location. These are officer safety issues. These are public safety issues. So we had to develop better capability with infusion centers. But when you look at the broad spectrum of all the agencies that have a role and responsibility in cyber, there was no cohesion. There was no communication. There was no network capability. And we started out with a network of analysts with infusion centers to build that piece up. Then we had our great friends in Secret Service and their facility at Hoover, Alabama, thanks to the Program Manager for the Information Sharing Environment and FEMA and DHS, to start building training classes for analysts. And we're in about our 8th iteration of that training course. But you know, that combination of education, training, and then the other piece was that common message. Who do you call? That's a common theme. Well, we came as close as we could with a common message to call any one of these 6 to 7 people. That's not really a common message to me. We got to get better at that. But we are, and we're getting better at identifying the threats. But we still have great losses. 2 weeks ago, I lost one of our local agencies in my area, which is the greater San Francisco area, lost their 911 system. And continually, it comes back to the things that this document will hopefully help those agencies with. So I'll pass on to the next.
Thank you. I think from a perspective that this report is really beginning to fill that gap, that the gap's been around for quite some time. So during the panel, I'm going to really throw on my Secret Service hat and my old Secret Service hat, and also throw on my new private industry hat as well. But I think what I really want to highlight, and Usha sort of highlighted it, and is the fact that the threats that we're facing now and that really are emanating from these criminal undergrounds, essentially is that marketplace where these advanced threat actors are really coming together to really conduct and communicate and collaborate on their attacks. And I always make the analogy that it's a rising tide lifts all boats, and essentially, no matter what your threat motivation is, be it hacktivism, cyber crime, or cyber espionage groups, they are all leveraging the community effort that's going on within the underground. And we were talking before coming out here about trust. Usha sort of targeted trust. And I think it's a unique situation that we see within the criminal underground that they have been scaling trust for quite some time, for the last 10 to 15 years. They're able to really cross borders anonymously, so to speak, and really work together, conduct these types of attacks. And for whatever direction, be it for public safety, against public safety, and or private industry, they're able to scale this trust that is really the biggest problem that we find here. The good guys, so to speak, trying to defend our networks, right? We have a trust deficit, be it from state and local to federal, but also to private industry. So I think this report really begins to show what we need to go to, or really move to, in building this way we need to become much better network defenders, right, overall. And, it's an asymmetric threat, and we need an asymmetric response. And the public-private partnerships are key to that. And because there's no way that any one entity, be it federal government, local, private industry, that has all the resources at its hands to actually help defend networks, right? So it's a community effort, and I think this really speaks to that. And I think hopefully as the panel goes on, we can show more examples on how we're doing that. And I think NCFI, from the Secret Service perspective of building capacity, training state and local law enforcement, judges and prosecutors, is something that we've been doing for quite some time, the Secret Service has. And I think that moving forward, but building the more operational response through the fusion centers, through the cyber analysts, I think are critical. And then even building other entities, such as in LA, so where we can really share actionable intelligence in real time, trying to build that capability. but I don't want to go any further. Take more time.
Thanks. So Chief Downing, on that issue of threat, what are the specific types of threats that you're most concerned about from the perspective of the Los Angeles Police Department when you look at the various cyber threat actors?
Yeah, well, I think not only the Los Angeles Police Department, but everybody we serve. In the city of LA, we have 44 departments. It's 4 really big departments: the Los Angeles World Airports, the LA Port, the Department of Water and Power, departments that actually cause our city to run normally. Without those, we'd be severely, severely diminished. And the type of attack, even our fusion center was attacked by a state actor at one time. Our police department was attacked. They tried to get into our intelligence system. They got into our email system. They tried to gain access to rosters and addresses. So this happened time and time again. And it wasn't until we really looked at the Secret Service model. The Secret Service has this model: whenever POTUS comes into a city, they overlay this enterprise temporarily on the area of operation. But we've never had one that's been sustainable in a community, a city, or a county. And so Jack Foray from the Secret Service really kind of on a napkin laid this out 4 years ago for us. And we built we kind of socialized this with the general managers, got the executive sponsorship of the mayor, got federal resources, developed over a year. We had planning meetings. We developed a business plan and took advantage of what the congressman talked about, the Urban Area Security Initiative, and reallocated $1.8 million to build this system, to build this center. And I think it's state-of-the-art, and I can talk a little bit more of the details in that as well. But we have to protect our cops, we have to protect our critical infrastructure, and those were the areas of attack that we were seeing.
Mike, if you wanted to add anything to that?
Yeah,
Same question?
from our perspective, oftentimes people are the weakest link. I mean, you could have the best technology on the planet, but without a trained group of folks out there, that is the biggest problem. Whether you have state actors, whether you have folks that just want to disrupt your systems, whether you have criminal folks that are engaged in trying to get your information, we've found time and time again, it's those folks that click on the wrong link, that go into the wrong website, that they shouldn't, or even the hygiene of the systems and the way that they've got their architecture. It's inconsistent, and the reason being, we have 18,000 law enforcement agencies out there serving 760,000 police officers. The problem is those 18,000 agencies don't have any commonality of their infrastructure. And talking about, we have 2 prongs kind of looking at this. One is that real-time information, machine-to-machine capability to understand and detect those threats. The other piece of that is the people, the education and understanding to track those threats down, identify them, and stop those threats from coming in the future, or at least figure out their method of attack.
So to that point, we've discussed training a bit and some of the high-end training that the Secret Service is supporting for the Fusion Center analysts, but what other types of training are necessary for line officers, beat cops, civilian employees within law enforcement agencies?
Absolutely. One of the projects that we did locally and that we recommend as a good practice is going out and actually doing spear phishing. We go to those local agencies and we say, hey, we want to test your personnel and see, will they click on this link? And this link will take them to a training site. So when they click on it, it basically takes them to a site that goes, you're the weakest link. You are in this chain, you are the person that potentially jeopardized your network. And here's the unfortunate part. Our return rates of people that click on that link are 7 to 10% in agencies. So all it takes is one person in the agency to decimate it.
Ed, do you want to?
Yeah, let me go back to the first question a little bit before I go into the training piece. But the other thing that we're seeing is the types of attacks that we're seeing, ransomware and destructive attacks. And it's steadily increasing. The ransomware attacks has really been exponentially growing. Even the first half of the year, we've seen 50 different variants really come open to the open market and being utilized in these attacks. And so just to give you perspective, we had 49 over 2014 and 15. So it's a line of business. These ransomware attacks are just another line of business where they're able to really monetize these attacks within days, right? Traditional cyber attacks, from a cybercrime perspective, it takes them months to really monetize it completely, the entire attack. And so this is this new model that is really hasn't been taken really up by hacktivist groups, but it's only a matter of time, right? So if hacktivist groups are really doing a denial of service attacks of some kind, a web defacement of public safety entities, well, that's going to be a matter of time where we're going to see ransomware. And we've already started to see it a little bit. But my point with that is the fact that it's a constantly dynamic threat landscape, and to get into the training piece it's a constant. It's hard to tell you you should be getting training in X or Y and Z. I think it's an incredible task to keep yourself up to date on all the threats that you're seeing daily. So that's why I think going back to the partnerships is critical, and leveraging your relationships and your partnerships across the board.
Thanks. There are a lot of lessons learned when looking at these set of issues from the experience over the past 15 years with respect to building the federal, state, local enterprise, with respect to Homeland Security and counterterrorism. But I think there's one critical difference that's noteworthy, which is that the role of the private sector as a source of expertise, as a provider of information in a way that's distinct and different from most of the counterterrorism issues. So as we're thinking about these sorts of relationships between the federal and state and local government, how do we make the private sector a critical part of that network too, in terms of the information that they have, and in a way that's useful, not just in a generic way, but for some of the specific requirements of state and local law enforcement?
Mike, right over.
You know, just to give you a quick example of, I think what Eduardo talked about in terms of trust, that's a big issue for us in the private sector, and also the issue of competitiveness. Not exposing trade secrets or anything relative to their enterprise. But with our center, we had the opportunity to collaborate with many federal agencies and intergovernmental agencies, including the FBI, the Secret Service, the California Military Department, the Joint Regional Intelligence Center, and also became a member of FBI's Cyber Hood Watch data portal. And because we had that collaboration, we actually shared threat data on attacks that we transferred over to the FBI, and they were able to thwart a major threat to a private financial institution because of that partnership that we had. And I think it's, so we put a credit in the bank on that incident, and I think we'll continue to put credits in the bank and build trust. The next phase for our center, for our ISOC, is to create a portal for the private sector to be able to come in and share their data with us as well. That's a huge paradigm shift. So not only are we trying to change the culture within the city environment, within law enforcement, to become first preventers as well as first responders, but we're trying to enhance that public trust relationship with the private sector to say, look, we can help each other, and you don't have to worry about your data being exposed or given to a competitor because we have this trust relationship. But we need to put a few more credits in the bank before we're successful at that.
And I come from a very weird perspective, being in Silicon Valley. When I first started talking to the folks in the industry about sharing information, about working together, and a lot of big personalities. And one of those big personalities goes, I'm good with all these guys dealing with their cyber issues, because that means I'm making money. And that was kind of the mindset that some of the folks had. And it's taken a number of years for folks to get to the point where they're talking with each other and identifying those threats, because they know that if one goes down, they're going to target the next one, or simultaneously. Or with the acquisition of smaller companies, which happens all the time in Silicon Valley, they're going to inherit a problem. So it's more of a mentality to help each other out. And one of the things that we did as a network of 78 fusion centers in building our cyber threat intelligence working group and our cyber intelligence network as itself is actually bringing in partners from the private sector who have the expertise, who have the capabilities to help us out in areas that we just don't have the resources. We struggle. I mean, we have 1,000 analysts in the network in the fusion centers, about 2,500 people from state and local agencies, about 500 from federal agencies. But throughout that, it's a very small group of people that have the expertise in cyber and that capability. And sustaining those people is hard. So we really have to rely on support from those experts that can give us a hand And the other piece is, and when we need, their assistance, we need to be able to call them up and say, hey, do you understand this problem? Can you help us out? And we've been looking at and actually testing out in California some technology, deploying it at different locations throughout the state to get that real-time threat information. So that's kind of that, you cannot do this. You cannot fight cyber without the help and participation of both federal, state, local, and private sector partners. It just won't work without it.
Yeah, it's hard to follow everybody else's comments, but I think from a private sector perspective now that I've had this hat on, I think it's not always an easy, I think the trust definitely is from private industry toward law enforcement and so forth, but I think for us, it's one of those things that we see it as a greater good. Like it's internally within Trend Micro, we look at it from our competitors are not other security software companies or cybersecurity companies. Our competitors are the individuals that we're going after to defend and help, arrest, prosecute, and extradite oftentimes. But so from our perspective, we have over 1,200 researchers, and we're constantly coming across information on how do we share this information. We know a crime's been committed, who do we share it with? So it's on this perspective, it's almost having the same lines in the road. Who do we go to, and who's the best? And sometimes it goes from victim notifications. We'll find a database from a particular breach or compromise and say, okay, we need to obviously identify law enforcement, but who's really going to be doing that victim notification, and who's really built to do that? And so it's more of an art form than a science, and I think things are being formalized as we go and move along. At the NCIC, I think when I was there, the biggest information sharing challenge was the DDoS attacks on the financial sector. We went into this battle mode, so to speak, of sharing information with the financial sector from government and back and forth. And before then, it was really just sharing, here's your PDF, here's your indicators of compromise, and it wasn't as timely, or it wasn't needed to be actionable. That changed the entire landscape of information sharing and really improved that process. Is it done? Nowhere near it. I think the information sharing has to be at the analyst level, from private industry to the fusion centers, for example, to law enforcement. But it's how we do that, and how can we do that, one, at the machine level when it's necessary, but also at the phone, right? And be those trusted advisors. We try to pride ourselves on being that trusted advisor. So if there's a phone call coming from local law enforcement or federal in the middle of the night, have you guys seen X, Y, and Z? We want to be able to respond, right? We want to be able to do it. Now, there's always challenges with certain types of information sharing and what we can do and not do, but it's a goal of ours to make sure that happens.
Thanks. One final question from me, and then we'll open it up to the audience for questions. If you look at the, reflecting on Chairman Donovan's remarks, where he talked about some of the legislation intended to improve federal support to state and local for cybersecurity, he focused on training, coordination, utilization of grant funds in support of cyber. From among those or other sets of issues, what are the things that state and local law enforcement really needs from the federal government for cyber? And what does a ideal end state look like in terms of the relationship between the FBI and the Secret Service and other federal agencies like ICE and the network of state and local law enforcement in terms of coordination, given the fact that the FBI and Secret Service is as effective as they are relatively small compared to the broader network of state and local law enforcement nationwide, and how can state and local LE be a force multiplier for broader efforts to combat cybercrime and other cyber threats within the U.S. So if any of you want to weigh in on that, and then we'll open it up.
Yeah. I think it's almost analogous to the whole urban area security initiative cycle that we've been involved in, I think, since 2004 or so. And for many, many years, and it's only until recently, we used that money to buy things, trucks and radios and equipment and computers and fences and cameras, et cetera, et cetera. And finally we said, okay, we have all these things, but should we start looking at developing human capital, our greatest resource, people? And should we start diverting money toward that, whether it's in building more resiliency in communities through training and awareness and orientation, and also leadership skills in cops relative to the types of threats we're dealing with. And I think we can say the same thing here. I think we really, Usha made a point in this guide made a point of saying, look, we have all these resources for you. Institutions and law enforcement need to get interested in this. We need a cultural paradigm shift to say, we all try to build crime resistance in communities. We need to build resistance in the cyber environment now, because this is the virtual training ground and the virtual ground where they're planning attacks. And so we need to shift officers' mindsets in creating this first preventer culture by doing that.
Absolutely. As far as on the federal side, I mean, there's lots of talk about this is the biggest threat out there. This is a horrible threat. But when it comes down to money and finances and basically that coordination effort of saying this is the way we're going to do business hasn't been strong on that area. And for us in the fusion centers, retention is a crucial part. We've got to have the resources for the analysts. I mean, there's a handful of analysts around the country right now that are those core people for me that I can call in Kansas City, used to be in Louisiana, but we've had folks transfer out, move around. We've had great partnerships with the MSISAC, Center for Internet Security in Greenbush, New York. We've had great contacts with all of our federal agencies, Secret Service, FBI. But we've got to have commonality of how we're going to operate in the future. There's got to be better direction, a more unified message on how this information is triaged. I can tell you how suspicious activity reporting for a physical threat is going to be processed or should be processed throughout the country. I have no idea or no way of telling you how to handle a cyber threat. It varies so much, and where does the information go? So we need the funding, we need the policy decisions, and we need the better coordination. And I need a way to retain the right personnel, because at the bottom of all of this, we can have the best technology in the world, but if we don't have the right people working in the right places, this will falter.
I think from the Secret Service perspective, and I think when we created our electronic crimes task forces back in 1995, I think over the years, as the threat started to become more sophisticated, we realized we had to become more sophisticated and develop additional partnerships and sort of really leverage everybody else's strengths. And that's why the NCFI was created. And to speak to how the Secret Service has been able to leverage NCFI is the way we obviously train and support and provide the equipment to those investigators, and then obviously the support for the prosecutors and judges, but where need be. But I think the biggest thing for us was several of our major successes in cybercrime investigations, prosecutions, and ultimate extraditions had really come at the really because of local law enforcement. So a lot of the local law enforcement that are members within our electronic crimes task forces, we provide them full access to run the investigation as the lead case agent / officer. And so they work directly with the U.S. Attorney's Office, and we work in direct support. So there's not a partnership to say that, hey, we'll give you training and we'll talk to you in a year to see how it went. No, it's a constant engagement and trying to leverage those skills that we develop. And every officer is not the same, but there's fantastic officers, men and women, that have gone through the training and are a huge asset to the Secret Service in providing that skill set.
So we'll open up to the audience for questions and discussion. If you have a question, please identify yourself and also direct the question to one or more of the panelists over there. And the microphone's coming.
Hello, my name is David. I work at the National Governors Association, and I was recently at the Homeland Security Advisory Council's release of their Cybersecurity Subcommittee's report. There was an interesting exchange where one of the advisors was summarizing the report, and she said, one of the things we found is state CIOs often don't know who to call in the event of an incident or a disruption. And Secretary Johnson said, well, I've been pretty clear who to call, it's the NCAP. And she said, well, they don't really know. And so I'm wondering, I'm not trying to point fingers here, but from your perspective, is the federal government not doing a good enough job yet of being transparent? Or are the locals and state governments not reaching out enough because they haven't prioritized it to the extent they should?
I'll answer from my opinion. I think it's a little bit of both, right? I mean, I hate to depends answer. I think speaking from when I sat at the NCIC, there was a lot of outreach that the NCIC did and does currently at the local, state and local level. But they're challenged, right? It's a challenge for resources. It's to be able to do that type of outreach consistently and have everybody be on the same message is critical. So working with MSI-SAC, working with the fusion centers has been that effort. Again, it's one of those things, it's a work in progress, but I think it's a little bit of both. I mean, I think from a CIO perspective at the state level, I think they're thinking not necessarily law enforcement, sometimes, depending on the attack. They're thinking mitigation and recovery, so who has the best tools to help them do that, right? So I think going forward, and unfortunately, what happens is that policy really doesn't change or that until you have an active campaign or attack going, right? So everybody knows that there was a problem of information sharing prior to the financial DDoS attacks, but it wasn't until those attacks came that the actual process became a much better, more efficient process, right? So.
The one thing I'd like to add on that is if I told you if somebody is burglarizing your house, call one of these 7 numbers, how would that end up for you? So marketing is huge. We've done a lot of work with DHS Cyber. Focusing efforts on the NCIC I think is huge. But you're absolutely right. And the other piece on this, and where the Fusion Center becomes very important, critical, is having folks on the ground that can help you there. Yeah. It's great to call someone on the other side of the coast but you've got to have a live human being that can help you right then and there. And you've got to have a relationship because that's a key part of what this is built on is trust. Yeah. You've got to have someone that you trust to call to help you out. Now, true, it could be, you call the dispatch center and the dispatch center gets that information to the folks that need it, but that really has not been institutionalized well.
And from my experience, I would just say that as law enforcement gets more interested in this subject, I mean, actionably interested, not just talking about it, but doing things with their policies and their structures to protect their infrastructure and develop those relationships and reach out. It's always been my experience that when we've asked the questions and we've reached out and we've asked for a partnership, like the Secret Service, I mean, we give hundreds and hundreds of cops to them when POTUS or VPOTUS or any of the dignitaries come in. And so we said, hey, how about you sharing something with us? We need some help on cyber. And they actually designed our whole program and are part of that committee. So I think it's kind of incumbent upon state and local law enforcement to reach out as well. I don't think we should wait for the federal government to say, hey, do you need some help? We got some money. But be interested in this, develop your own capability, and then ask the feds for assistance.
I just add a couple quick things to that from my perspective. On Homeland Security and counterterrorism, it arguably took about a decade for those relationships to mature to even sort of a initial level of, solid communication capability. And I'd say we're probably in year 3 for cybersecurity. And, in a lot of cases, some of the issues are federal state, but sometimes these issues are due to dynamics within a state where you don't have effective communication between the Homeland Security advisor, the primary law enforcement agency, the emergency managers, the adjutant generals. Then you add the CIO to the mix in the case of cybersecurity. So I think in some cases, this has to do with best practices at the state level in terms of how different agencies, state agencies are working together. Frank?
So I want to build on the point you just mentioned, Christian, but also a statement you made, Mike Downing. How important was it getting the mayor's involvement in standing up your center? Because if you look at publicly traded companies, now it's 100%. Cybersecurity is a governance board decision, issue, constantly being briefed to the highest level. I don't think it's at that stage, and in part because just like the HSAs were in 2002, some were adjutant general, some were out of former FBI agents, it was dispersed throughout. But how important was getting the mayor's involvement, and how do you sustain that? Is there a way to do continuous reporting?
Yeah.
And how often does that get to the top?
It was absolutely critical. 4 years ago, when we convened the meeting with all the general managers, the 44 GMs that make up our city, we did a shock and awe. We told them, about state attacks, insider threat, et cetera, and we did it for the purposes of scaring them. And then we wanted to say, so how do we do this together? How do we build a center that where everybody's involved? And by the way, you may have to dedicate some people to this. And the response was, even though we get along well, was, hey, LAPD can't tell us what to do. But the mayor can, because they serve at the behest of the mayor. And so a year later, the mayor authored an executive directive, Executive Directive number 2, which directed the GMs to participate in this, actually told them to participate in it. So then we had a real team, then we had accountability to this, because without the mayor's involvement, at the time, the Deputy Mayor of Public Safety, Eileen Decker, was instrumental as well, and she worked with the mayor to get this done. She's now the U.S. Attorney for Central District in L.A., but she was crucial to this as well. And I just think you need that executive sponsorship to get this off the ground and going. And now everybody's proud of this program. They're proud of what they did. It has become a learning intrusions and develop new cyber tools. I always say, we're not experts at this, we're students at it, and we continue to learn. But the mayor, as being involved in this and also proud of what was accomplished, got the whole city involved in sustaining it. And it will be sustained and it will continue to grow.
One of the things I wanted to add on that, especially the executive level buy-in, one of the things one of our fusion centers out in Tennessee came up with was actually giving a cyber briefing on the threats to folks, but also for those folks that were traveling overseas, because we do have mayor's offices and we do have governors and other people in the state that travel, or we get visitors from foreign countries. And that nice shiny thumb drive that they give you, exactly. And it's having the discussion of the hygiene, the need to have things reviewed if they're brought in or given to you as a gift. And those are the things that start clicking with them, especially when they find out that gift could have compromised the entire state network or city network.
Is there a question back there?
Thank you. I actually have 2 questions. What we have here is a dual situation, hence 2 questions. One, police departments throughout the country need to protect their own systems, so we don't read about them in the ransomware notices. On the other hand, the other issue is police departments throughout the country have to or are supposed to be investigating cyber crime. And I apologize, I'm Ann Lidlina, Leapfrog Solutions. So from both a practitioner helping to protect the public and then protecting your own as well, you've got these 2 challenges. What are you hoping that this blueprint, which is terrific, how do you see that playing out in the next 12 months for the cities, villages, communities, et cetera? And then is there going to be a counterpart dealing with how to improve cybersecurity investigations and crime solving at the local level?
Well, from my perspective, I hope it builds more of a desire, both politically and budgetarily, to show that this problem is only going to get worse and we have to deal with it in the future. We don't investigate all the cyber crimes. We do some, in LA we do some, but we rely heavily on our federal partners if it's significant. We also are involved in the hunt and pursue, on the terrorist side, in developing leads for our Joint Terrorism Task Force. And we have a pretty big capability in a local police department to do that. So I hope that my goal is to build a structure so that ultimately we have a cyber division within LAPD that you can kind of pull all this in, because I think at least in our department we have this decentralized, right? We have 21 precincts and everybody has a type of cyber capability. So if they have an event in their jurisdiction, they're putting geofences up, they're looking at Twitter feeds, they're looking at Facebook, Instagrams. If we have the Academy Awards, we set a geofence up, and we have people talking about guns, and they're on a mountain, and we launch an airship, and we use a FLIR to try to detect them. We all do that from cyber. So there's so many component parts of cyber, whether it be penetrations, intrusions, crime, and hopefully what this will do is show that there's a real need for law enforcement to kind of develop a capability that they don't have and put their money where their mouth is, and get politicians and city councils and things to be aware of this emerging, evolving threat, so that budgets get approved to develop bigger capabilities.
My goal is to reduce that high risk that many agencies have right now because they're totally unaware of the threat. Trying to get that education out there, and literally because their primary responsibilities are dealing with physical safety issues in their community. Most agencies do not have a cyber team. They don't have folks that do these investigations. And over the last few years, the Association of State Criminal Investigative Agencies started building a stronger network of investigators in each state, at least at the state level, that could handle those cases that weren't at the level of the Secret Service or FBI because of financial reasons. And the incentive to that was one of those agency states got hit hard financially. To them it was hard, but it didn't meet the thresholds. But they basically have set up the mechanism for those folks to be kind of a stopgap for those smaller cases that affect the states. But we'll never get every cyber investigation, every loss of funding. That will never happen. It is that prioritization of resources.
If I could just add, one thing that causes things to change as well is a crisis, because it brings both a danger and an opportunity. And if you remember when Sony was hit, I think the damage on that was under $100 million or something, but huge amount of money, right? It got everybody's attention, even the politicians. And so that kind of created an opportunity to say, hey, this is coming. Look what they just did to Sony in our own backyard, a state actor. So those kinds of incidents also are helpful to us to create change.
From my perspective, it's sort of unique. From the Secret Service perspective, those two questions are constantly being asked, every day, because we have the investigative function and the resources dedicated to that. And then, for me, from my personal perspective, I jumped from that investigative side into Deputy CISO and then CISO with the Secret Service, and I had to do the network defense side. So it was actually helpful for me to understand what was going on the other side of the fence and the resources available to the agents and what we were seeing from a threat landscape, but also the type of relationships we needed to build to do a much better network defense, right? So I think the key thing, even at a very micro level, the way the Secret Service does that is you have to prioritize, right? You have to understand and look at what you have and where you can focus in on. And from the investigations point of view, for years, it was only going after your, I would say, top tier, but it's really not a hierarchical model. It's a very asymmetric, the Russian underground, so these Russian-speaking threat actors. It is really going after the most influential individuals within the underground, because you couldn't really go after every threat actor, because of just limited resources. So I think it's a constant question that you're being asked to do it, and I think my recommendation for those, and as state and locals departments move into that direction, is exactly that, the prioritization. But I think what Mike mentioned is creating a cyber division is critical, because we found it internally. We have our critical systems, I say our, Secret Service has its critical systems protection program, and it's really focused on the protection side of the house when it comes to cyber. But we also have our other cyber investigative groups and divisions. So it's one of those things that, and we realized from a manpower perspective, it was easier to utilize that same individual who's trained for the protection side as well as the investigative side. Now, is it something that, the report mentions really building upon that, creating a career track? We've been struggling, the Secret Service has been struggling for years trying to do that, because you were constantly under demands from a protection side of the house, but also investigations on how do you keep highly qualified individuals really at the cutting edge, right? Because once you start and move away from this, because it's such a dynamic environment, once these individuals move away from either investigating or actually being network defenders, it's a perishable skill. People don't just they don't get a brain dump, but they have to then re-engage, and you have to get retrained and keep moving. And training is a daily thing.
Question up here, and then to you, Chuck, for the final question.
Thank you. Paul Joyle, NSI. I wanted to pick up on Mr. Cabrera's statement about information sharing on the part of the adversary. They're trading information, intelligence, exploitation kits, etc. And they're doing it across borders, as you pointed out. Do you think it's time that we also engage in a dedicated state and local information sharing, kind of an ISAC structure that we can use not only to help other departments see what may be coming after them next, but also increasing the awareness of departments on the types of threats that exist? And just to Chief Downing, what was the dwell time on the APT actor that you mentioned on your system?
I'll go first. Yes, the answer is yes. How do you get there? Much harder. Mike's been working and trying to do that and improve that capability. But again, there's the history there. Like Mike alluded to, you started on the physical side with fusion centers and really meeting that need, right? Then how do you then scale and create cyber analysts that can be that focal point on the ground? Because I can't reiterate what we were saying earlier. A CIO is not going to want to call. I mean, the NCIC is good for information sharing, and so you can have that accordion effect, and you share information so other critical infrastructure and/or entities that are being attacked can utilize this information to defend themselves, right? So there's the information sharing piece, but the actual person on the ground, that trust, I think is critical. And I don't think any one entity or group really has, because one group might have a lot of people, but not the training and expertise in that area. Then other groups might not have a little bit of resources or things such as the Secret Service, but we need to rely on state and locals to really expand that reach. But again, I think it's definitely, we need to get there. How do you get there? It's, I think, a work in progress. I think the challenges are funding and ultimately trust.
Absolutely. And Paul, I'm afraid to create one more entity. I think we got enough in federal government, but we do need something that ties people together. We need that string that brings them together and creates a unified process for the way we work. And that has been the hardest thing. I could tell you there's people in this room that have bounced their heads against walls just with me on having to move forward. And we've done a lot of that. We broke a lot of eggs doing it, but we're making it work to a certain level, but we got to do better. This is, I really find it absurd in many ways that we've progressed very far on the physical realm of security, and we are so far behind in my mind. I feel like we're 7 years behind in the cyber world.
And the question was for me, how long were they, and I think your question was, how long were they in our system? Yeah. Well, on the Fusion Center, I think it was about 10 minutes until they were pushed over into a type of a sandbox. Yeah.
Chuck, final question, and then just so the attendees know, we do have some lunch afterwards after we wrap up outside in the area where you registered for continuing the discussion after we finish up the formal part of the session.
Tony Summerlin, I worked at the information sharing environment, helped write the legislation, so Mike and I have shared that problem. I agree with you, Mike, never waste a good disaster, but even after Sony, all they did is talk, and when Christian was up on the Hill, I think the last count I had were there were 138 bills for cyber that can't get passed. So the 7 years is really, but anyway, that's just a comment. But Secret Service is awesome. I work with them in banking, and I think the difference is trust, right? I mean, I happen to know of a breach that the FBI refused to notify a very large institution for 5 months because they wanted to run upstream. Not a behavior that instills any trust in the private sector. Secret Service does not behave that way at all. Just thought I'd put that footnote in. So creating this trust and this trusted environment, I think is huge. But when the government has an initiative, CNCI 5, to join 6 centers, information centers, and they work on it for 12 years and can't do it, I agree adding another thing isn't. But the thing from the top. What would you do? What is it going to take from the top to get Congress to do something to try to get this to go? Because as Mike says, you know, dialing 7 numbers to try to resolve your issue is not an answer at all.
I'll sort of add to the 7-year timeframe. Well, back in 2010, and this had already been going for quite some time, was it a data breach notification law? It was always dubbed the data breach notification law for the longest time. And it had different iterations for each year until each year it kept on failing and failing. But that was in 2010. And I want to say that I probably came in not even at the beginning, you know, and when we had to internally within DHS add comments and you know, really be a part of the process to help possibly get that bill passed. And it was just year after year that we think it sort of was a running joke, will it actually get passed? And that was just based on, you know, data breach notifications and having a single law instead of 50 different laws for data breach notification. So I just wanted to add that. But one thing, God, it's very difficult, from my opinion, to really see is there any one thing. And you really would hope that it would not be coming to a major attack and then everything changes, right? And then everybody said, you know, unfortunately, I hate to be the pessimist, I almost think that it almost needs, that's what it's going to take. But I think constant pressure, definitely. I think, like the congressman was mentioning, I mean, the support at the local level and constantly making this as a priority. And I think the way Frank put it at the board level now in the private industry, I wouldn't say it's 100%, but the board involvement and attention is there. And it really hasn't been because there was some kind of effort. It was been this constant drumbeat of attacks getting everybody's attention. So, but I'll let everybody else maybe comment.
Yeah, and you know, what would it take? What will it take to make a difference? And nothing, you know, and that's the hard part. You know, if we have one bomb go off, it causes ripples throughout, you know, Congress. We lose billions of dollars financially through a cyber attack, and no one really pays that much attention. We lose all of our personal history information through the Office of Personal Management to a foreign government who knows everything about me and my family and everything in my life now, to basically, in my mind, use it to, you know, co-op sources in the future. Yeah. And that has not caused it. Unfortunately, cyber is, I hate to say it, but it's not sexy. It's not flashy. Yeah. It's one of those things that doesn't get people's attention until it affects them personally. So until that happens to each member of Congress, we probably won't see the drive.
You know, I think, though, that other than other than crisis, the associations that we have in law enforcement, major city chiefs, major county sheriffs, all the state associations, all those associations, they have a loud voice and they have personal relationships with Congress. And oftentimes we will write a resolution, either IACP or major city chiefs or major county sheriffs, and Chuck DeWitt will walk up and deliver that and get our message, and the voice gets loud. And I think that helps too. I don't think that will happen, though, until they get more oriented to this threat. They understand the devastation that it could have in terms of shutting down SCADA systems and power and port and things like that, when it really starts to impact their budgets and their pocketbook.
I will say, you know, thinking back, I think the one thing it's interesting we're seeing in Europe, right, from a data privacy perspective, that's driving a lot of change from the top down, right? So I'm not saying that's something to look to, but I think possibly the data privacy piece and really bringing it back down to actual creating laws or stronger laws around data privacy, then that could then push other action. But again, that requires, you know, additional legislation. But I think that piece is really important, because I think it's one thing that's going to be driving in Europe for the next 5 years is that interest and concern.
I think, to Congress's credit, I think the dam has broken a bit on cybersecurity legislation. At the end of 2014, there were a number of smaller cyber bills that were signed into law. You had cyber information sharing in the omnibus at the end of 2015, a number of bills that have passed the House, as Congressman Donovan referred to, and a proposal now to reorganize DHS's cyber activities to create a new cyber and infrastructure protection division or bureau or agency. So you do have a lot of efforts going on there. I think the harder problem is going to be some of the funding issues. And when you talk about moving cyber through the FEMA grant process with all the challenges with that in terms of accountability, performance management, knowing actually how funds have been spent through that process, it's, I think that's an issue that needs to be thought through carefully in terms of if that is the right mechanism, how it's done effectively, or are there other mechanisms to look at funding cyber at the state and local level? And turn it over to Frank.
Let me just thank everyone for joining us today. Let me thank our great partners, Chuck, Usha, and the leadership at NCAP. Let me thank our panelists, all very longtime friends. Let me also say, what will it take? It actually takes people like this. It's the Paul Reveres who keep pushing. You're going to have a lot of blood, a lot of sweat, and a lot of tears, but ultimately that's what it is going to take. It's not going to have to be driven by an external event. These guys keep pushing, we keep pushing with them, and at the end of the day, it's about arming those on the front lines with knowledge. So thank you all, grab a sandwich, and thanks for joining us today.